Okay, going on with chapter 39, picking up where I left off from the previous video here. Does the economy self-correct? I think you already know that classical economic approach is going to say yes, the economy will correct itself. And that idea is based on the idea of flexible prices, that maybe in the very short run, certain output prices are not downward flexible, or certain input prices, in fact, even in the medium run, certain input prices may not be very flexible, especially downward. Um, Given enough time, whatever that may mean, 6 months, a year, 2 years, who knows, prices are always flexible. So it's just the standard explanation that we've talked about with demand pull inflation and cost push inflation, that there is an aggregate demand, there's a short run aggregate supply, and there's a long run aggregate supply. And if the economy goes into recession, prices are eventually going to come down. The price level will go from P1 down to P2. Input prices will go down. Aggregate supply will actually shift to the right. Because of that, as it shifts more and more to the right, it'll eventually shift this far to the right, AS prime, there's AD prime, and the economy has self-corrected. And hey, at a lower price level, that's great, okay? And of course, this is full employment output, okay? Back here, we were in that recession. If there is too much aggregate demand and we get demand pull inflation, okay, we're going to start off with AS1 and AD1 here, or AD sub 0, AS sub 0, and AD sub 0. Start off here. We'll go to here and we'll get some inflation, but eventually prices, input prices, wages are going to rise because employers are making more money. People need to buy the increased output of stuff, so wages are going to rise, and aggregate supply is going to start shifting back to the left, and eventually it's going to shift this far to the left. We'll get AS double prime, and this would have been AD double prime when we got too much aggregate demand and it caused inflation. We wind up here, and lo and behold, we're right back at full employment. So the economy always self-corrects. The question is, how long will it take to self-correct? And does the society and the government overseeing that society have the wherewithal to just sit down and leave it alone? Laissez-faire economics. Let it be, let it correct itself. Now, when you become an economics major and you really get into this, it's obviously a lot more complicated than we simplistically talk about it in introductory economic theory. Interest rates are involved, and all kinds of other things also in these adjustment mechanisms. Some people even argue that the correction mechanism is very rapid if we had really totally free markets. The question is, how free are our markets? How much are markets dominated and manipulated by wealthy individuals, wealthy corporations, politicians? To get the kind of free markets that would allow this price flexibility and this quick self-correction is probably not something that we have in our society today. So the mainstream view, which is the dominant view, even though there are a lot of economists that consider themselves monetarists, there's been very little criticism of the stimulus that is going on right now in Congress to try to bring things back. There was very little stimulus of this criticism of the stimulus package back in 2009 that addressed the recession we had back then. So the Keynesian or the neo-Keynesian, the mainstream view is, well, there's your aggregate demand curve, but your aggregate supply curve doesn't necessarily look like this intermediate sloping thing. Whereas the aggregate supply curve might start off looking like that. In fact, this portion of it, I'm making a dashed line because in reality, that's what it looks like. at that price level. Price level sub zero, we'll call it. AD sub zero, AS sub zero. Yeah, there's a long run aggregate supply that is at full employment output. But if we go into a recession to AD prime here, we're not going to come down to this price level. We're going to move over here. And notice that if we went down to that price level, the recession would only be that deep. But no, we come all the way back here. The recession is even deeper than it otherwise would have been because prices are downward sticky. Remember all that. So that's a main part of the mainstream theory here, is that the aggregate supply curve probably looks more like this kinked thing here, right here. The ratchet effect that we called it earlier on. What can happen here is that we can wind up in something called a liquidity trap, a word that I brought up last week at one point, I think, where there is liquidity in the banking system. There's money available to be loaned out, but nobody wants to borrow it. Or even if you do make people borrow it, notice I said make people, coerce them to borrow it somehow, they're going to sit on it. They're not going to spend it. They're not going to use it for investment spending. They're too afraid that if they borrow money and spend it, they won't be able to pay the money back. So we wind up stuck back here. And Keynes' analysis of that during the early 1930s was actually pretty insightful. The only way to get the economy back on its track was for government to do that spending, because businessmen were not going to borrow and spend money. They were too afraid. Government had to step in and borrow that money. All right, so the economy does not self-correct, mostly because of downward sticky prices, a very slow adjustment of price mechanisms. Here, yeah, the economy adjusts back quickly, fairly quickly, because we believe that prices are much less sticky than those people think that they are. So today in economic thought, you still have some people saying that, leave it alone, laissez-faire, it'll correct itself. But at least as of right now in our recession, most people are on the bandwagon that there should be a stimulus package for fiscal policy, and monetary policy should be involved also. Remember that monetary policy is thought to be less effective in helping an economy recover from a recession, that fiscal policy is the more effective way to go. So yes, we are creating the liquidity. The Federal Reserve is putting a lot of money out there. The federal government in its bailout package is providing a lot of loans to businesses. The question is, will they in fact spend that money? Or how will they spend it? Will they spend it in a way that will make it very easy for them to recoup it and pay it back if their productivity doesn't go up? All right, the last part of the chapter is talking about rules or discretion. And so one of the main things you needed to learn in chapter 39 was the equation of exchange. And we took care of that in the earlier video. Hopefully you're going to remember that. MV equals PQ, and instability is because of bad policy regarding the money supply. And if we get too much money out there, it's just going to cause inflation because the price level has to go up. All right. The last thing that you really need to learn in this chapter is this idea of a monetary rule. And it's mostly, in fact, it's entirely a monetarist idea. It's rooted in Milton Friedman's work, the guy I mentioned in the last video, who said that what we want is for an economy to be growing. We want this long-run aggregate supply to shift to the right on a regular basis as smoothly as possible. And if it's shifting to the right, we need aggregate supply and aggregate demand shifting to the right with it. The best way to have that happen, he said, is for the money supply to grow at the same rate that you are hoping the economy grows. If you want your aggregate supply to be shifting to the right by about 4% per year, then you need the money supply to grow by about 4% per year. Think of the equation of exchange, money supply going up by 4%, MV on the left side. If the quantity of goods and services go up by 4% also, the price level can remain stable. So that's the monetary rule. no matter what's going on in the economy, the money supply should grow by a consistent roughly 4%, 3 to 5% per year. And in today's world, we've downgraded our expectations on economic growth to about, hopefully, 2.5 to 3% per year. So the money supply should grow by roughly 2.5 to 3% per year. And that should be the rule, okay? And we don't play around with it to try to stimulate or contract the economy. We just grow the money supply, and government keeps a relatively balanced budget. So that's the monetary rule. Discretionary monetary policy argues that the rule is great, but it doesn't address liquidity traps if they occur. And of course, your book goes into a long list of policy successes on page 797, where mainstream economists with stimulus packages or with using monetary policy to slow down the growth of the money supply have in fact had a very good impact on keeping growth at a pretty consistent rate and keeping inflation in check over the years. So that's chapter 39. We'll wrap that up on Thursday. Hopefully you'll watch this video either before Thursday or on Thursday at noon and read the chapter and do some of the FRQs that I'm going to throw your way. Okay? All right. Talk to you later.